Music was playing. Families were laughing. Children were moving between food stalls and flags. This was supposed to be a celebration. On a spring afternoon in Vancouver, a Filipino community festival was filled with color, culture, and routine joy. Then, without warning, a vehicle entered the crowd. No argument, no chaos beforehand. Just seconds enough to turn a public gathering into a mass casualty scene. When the movement stopped, 11 people were dead. What happened next unfolded fast. Emergency sirens, police lines, witnesses in shock, and a city struggling to understand how a festival became the site of one of Canada's deadliest vehicle attacks. Authorities moved quickly, but answers came slowly. This is not a story built on speculation or rumor. It's a reconstruction based on confirmed timelines, official statements, and what is still before the courts. We will separate what is known from what remains unanswered. Because in cases like this, the most important question isn't only what happened, it's how something so ordinary became irreversible in a matter of moments. The day began like hundreds of others across Canada. In Vancouver, members of the Filipino community gathered for a public street festival meant to celebrate culture, family, and identity. Food stalls lined the route. Music played through speakers. Volunteers moved between booths. Families arrived together, many with children, expecting nothing more than an afternoon of routine joy. This was not a closed or restricted event. It was open, accessible, and familiar, the kind of gathering that blends into the normal rhythm of city life. Streets were active. Foot traffic was heavy. There was no indication of heightened risk, no visible tension, no disruption that suggested what was about to happen. Witnesses later described the atmosphere as calm and crowded but orderly. People stood shoulder to shoulder near performance areas. Others crossed the street between vendors. Vehicles were nearby, as they often are at city events, but nothing about their presence felt unusual at the time. Then, in a matter of moments, that normal rhythm broke. A vehicle entered the festival area and moved directly into the crowd. There was no warning sequence that people could react to in time. No audible argument, no gradual escalation, just impact, confusion, and immediate panic. People ran, others froze. Some tried to help those who had fallen, while others searched for family members in the chaos. What had been a celebration became a scene defined by shock and injury, unfolding faster than most people could process. Emergency calls flooded dispatchers almost instantly. Sirens followed. Police and medical responders moved in as the scale of the incident became clear. Streets were shut down. The festival space turned into an active crime scene. By the time authorities began confirming details, the reality was already devastating. Multiple people were critically injured. Lives had been lost, and a community that had come together to celebrate was left trying to understand how the day had ended in mass violence. In the next part, we'll reconstruct the attack itself step by step, focusing only on what has been confirmed, and explaining how investigators established the timeline without speculation or assumption. As the evening continued, the festival was still active. People were drifting between food stalls, music played in the background, and families lingered in the street, unhurried. Nothing in the atmosphere suggested danger. There was no visible disturbance, no argument, no sudden panic building in advance. Then a vehicle entered the festival space. It moved directly into a dense section of the crowd. There was no meaningful warning time, no gradual approach people could react to. The shift from celebration to catastrophe happened in seconds. Impact replaced music. Confusion replaced routine. People scattered in every direction. Some ran. Others froze. Several turned back instinctively, trying to help those who had fallen or were trapped. Shoes, bags, and personal items were left behind as the street filled with noise, shouting, and shock. Parents searched for children. Friends called out names that didn't answer back. Emergency calls began almost immediately. Sirens followed soon after. What had been an open, public gathering became a restricted scene, with police moving quickly to secure the area and paramedics triaging victims where they lay. The scale of the damage became clear in fragments, not all at once. The driver did not escape. Police took a suspect into custody at the scene, and the vehicle was secured as evidence. Investigators began marking distances, photographing positions, and separating witnesses, starting the process of turning a moment of chaos into a structured timeline. As information slowly emerged, one fact stood out above all others. This was not random injury. It was mass harm. Lives had been lost in a space meant for community and celebration, and the consequences were irreversible. In the next part, we'll move past the moment of impact and focus on what followed, how first responders stabilized the scene, how authorities communicated with the public, and how the investigation formally began once the street fell silent. In the minutes after the vehicle stopped, the scene split into two worlds. One side was raw survival, people screaming for help, strangers kneeling in the street, hands trying to stop bleeding, voices calling names. The other side was procedure moving in fast, sirens closing in, officers pushing vehicles back, paramedics carving out space to triage, and the festival route turning into a controlled perimeter. Police locked the area down quickly. They cleared lanes for ambulances. They separated witnesses from the injured so first responders could work. The street that had been filled with food and music became a corridor of flashing lights and urgent commands. And as the first wave of emergency care began, another process started in parallel: preserving the scene. Officers marked where the vehicle traveled. Investigators photographed positions, distances, and damage. Witnesses were pulled aside, one by one, to give initial statements, often incomplete, often shaken, sometimes contradictory, because trauma scrambles memory in real time. This is how major investigations begin. Not with perfect clarity, but with fragments that have to be built into a timeline. The suspect was taken into custody at the scene. There was no prolonged search, no hours-long manhunt. That fact mattered because it allowed police to stabilize the public fear that often follows a mass casualty event. But it also raised a harder question. If the driver was already in custody, what exactly had just happened and why? In the first public updates, authorities focused on what they could confirm without inflaming speculation. They confirmed multiple deaths and a large number of injuries. They urged the public to avoid the area and to let emergency crews work. They asked witnesses to come forward, but also warned that details would be limited while the investigation was active and families were being notified. As the night continued, the information arrived in a grim rhythm. Numbers became clearer. The death toll rose. Injuries were described as serious, and hospitals moved into emergency intake mode. A celebration that had drawn families across the city was now tied to phone calls that no family ever wants to receive. Then came a line authorities repeated early, because it shaped how the public understood the event. They said they did not believe it was terrorism. That statement didn't answer the deepest question motive, but it narrowed the frame. It signaled that investigators were looking at a different kind of explanation, one that might be rooted in an individual rather than an ideological campaign. By late night and into the next day, Vancouver's mood shifted. The city did what cities do after a public tragedy. It slowed down. People left flowers. Community members gathered quietly. Leaders spoke about grief, solidarity, and support for victims and the Filipino community. But under every speech was the same reality: this was not a story that could be wrapped up with comfort. Because even with an arrest, even with a secured scene, the hardest part of a case like this is always the same: turning a single violent moment into a legal story that can be proven in court. In the next part, we'll follow that transition: what investigators and prosecutors announced, what charges were laid, what authorities said was confirmed, and what remained unanswered as the case moved from the street into the justice system. Once the scene was cleared and the streets reopened, the case shifted into its most controlled phase. What had unfolded in seconds now had to be examined over weeks and months, under rules that allow no shortcuts. Investigators focused on 3 parallel tracks. The first was evidence. The vehicle was secured and examined in detail. Data from onboard systems, damage patterns, and the path it traveled were analyzed to establish intent and sequence. Cameras from nearby businesses, traffic systems, and private phones were collected to reconstruct the movement frame by frame. Each angle added clarity, but also responsibility, because once evidence is gathered, it has to withstand courtroom scrutiny. The second track was the suspect. Police confirmed the identity of the man taken into custody and began the formal process of interviews, background checks, and forensic assessments. At this stage, investigators avoided public speculation. Motive was not announced. Mental state was not debated openly. Authorities limited statements to what could be proven and charged, knowing that premature conclusions can damage a case before it ever reaches trial. The third track was the legal framework. Prosecutors reviewed the evidence and laid murder charges, marking the transition from investigation to prosecution. From that point forward, every detail became part of an active court process. What could be said publicly narrowed. What could be shown became restricted. Publication limits shaped what the public would learn and what would remain sealed until trial. This is often the most misunderstood phase of a high-profile case. Silence is mistaken for uncertainty. Caution is mistaken for weakness. In reality, this is where cases are either built properly or quietly fall apart later. Every statement is weighed. Every disclosure is deliberate. Authorities reiterated that the incident was not being treated as terrorism. That clarification mattered legally because it shaped how the charges were framed and how the case would proceed. But it did not answer the question people kept asking: why? And in criminal law, that question doesn't come first. What comes first is whether the act can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, whether intent can be established, whether the evidence supports the most serious charges. Only then does motive become relevant, and even then, only if it can be supported by fact rather than assumption. As the case moved forward, the public was left with a partial picture by design. Families were notified privately. Court dates were scheduled. Lawyers prepared. The story left the street and entered a system built to move slowly, methodically, and out of view. In the final part, we'll step back from the courtroom and look at what this case left behind, how it reshaped a community, what questions remain unanswered, and why incidents like this force cities to confront uncomfortable truths about public safety, prevention, and vulnerability. Long after the crime scene was cleared, the impact continued to spread. For the Filipino community in Vancouver, the loss was personal and collective. A celebration meant to honor culture and togetherness became tied to grief. Vigils appeared. Memorials grew. Names replaced numbers. The city paused not in silence, but in reflection, trying to reconcile how a place of joy became a place of mourning. Beyond the immediate loss, the case reopened difficult questions that surface after every mass casualty event. How do cities protect open, public gatherings without turning them into fortified spaces? Where does responsibility lie when everyday infrastructure becomes a weapon? And what warnings, if any, are realistically visible before something like this happens? There are also questions the justice system does not answer quickly. Court proceedings move deliberately, and much of what the public wants to understand, motive, mental state, warning signs, can take years to surface. If they surface at all, some answers may never be fully known. Others will be filtered through testimony, expert analysis, and legal thresholds that don't align neatly with public emotion. What remains clear is this: incidents like this don't exist in isolation. They force cities to examine how ordinary spaces can become vulnerable, how fast normalcy can collapse, and how communities recover when violence interrupts daily life without warning. This case is not only about a single act or a single individual. It's about the lasting effect on families who will never return to that festival the same way, and a city that must carry the memory forward while deciding what changes, if any, are possible. The legal process will continue. Facts will be tested. Verdicts will come in time. But for the people affected, the outcome will never restore what was taken. And that is the hardest truth in cases like this. Even when the system works as designed, the cost is permanent. This is where the story ends for now, not with closure, but with accountability still unfolding, and a reminder of how fragile public moments can be when the ordinary turns irreversible.